So to begin this evening, I would like to introduce Dr. Kathy Short. Dr. Kathy Short is a professor in the program of Language, Reading, Culture, and College of Education at the University of Arizona. She has worked effectively and extensively with TUSD teachers and several teachers within the state of Arizona to develop curriculum that actively involves students as readers and inquirers. Her work focuses on global children and adolescent literature, curriculum as inquiry, and intellectual and intercultural understanding. Dr. Short is also the director of World of Words, an initiative to build bridges across global cultures through literature, and has also been awarded several President Awards, one of them being the U.S. National Section of International Board of Books for Young Children, as well as the National Council of Teachers of English Language. So with further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kathy Short for our keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? No. It's on my phone. Okay, thank you. Let's see. I'm just waiting. Can you turn on the... Is it turning on? Sorry. Got it? I can just start talking. Is that, or you need this?
It's on. The microphones are on too. But
Let me just go ahead and start. We'll see if that gets working. So the title of what I'm going to talk about is the title of this symposium, which is around mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, cultivating optimal learning environments. What I thought I'd do is that notion of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors comes out of the work of Regine Simpson. So I wanted to start with her work a little bit and talking about her use of that metaphor and why I think it's so important, and use that as a way to then provide a conceptual frame to think about, well, what does that mean if we're creating optimal learning environments? What my role, I think, in this symposium is to provide that conceptual overview, and then you have breakout sessions where people are really going to give you very practical examples of what this looks like in classrooms and the specifics of different things that you might be able to do. Regine Sims Bishop is a scholar who has spent all of her life really studying and looking at African American literature and children's literature and the need for that literature in children's lives. And then talking about that also more broadly at the level of multicultural. And she began her work really in the 1960s in response to at that point, the all-white world of children's books. and really began documenting why books representing people of color was so important, and what was happening with that literature, and what ways were they reaching and not reaching children. She talked about windows, and these were quotes that I noticed that were in the advertisement for the symposium that went out earlier. She said windows, and she was specifically focusing on books. We're going to focus more broadly. But she said books can be windows that offer views of the world that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. And that some of those windows can be sliding glass doors. And a sliding glass door is when the window is one that readers can walk through in their imagination in order to become part of that world. Whereas mirrors are when a window becomes self-reflective, like a mirror. And that window reflects human experiences back on us so that we can see ourselves and our experiences as part of the human condition. Today, we're going to talk about what Rudine talked about, but in a much broader way, in thinking about that classrooms can and should be windows where children are able to experience views of the world that are real or imagined. And that some of those windows in our classrooms are one that are sliding glass doors, where children enter worlds that they don't know, worlds that that have not been part of their own cultural experiences, but through what we're offering them in our classrooms, they're able through their imagination to become part of that world, whether through some kind of inquiry. And then mirrors, that some of the windows in our classrooms absolutely need to be windows that are mirrors, where children are able to reflect back and see their lives and experiences. Now, as we're talking today, one of the things I really want you to think about is, sort of part of this frame is thinking about culture in a very broad way. Because often I think we reduce culture to ethnicity and really don't look more broadly at all of the different cultural identities that we each have. Because culture are ways of living and being in the world that influence our actions, our beliefs, our values. There are shared patterns that we share with a particular group of people, maybe small or large, but those patterns set the tone, character, and quality of our lives and are very dynamic. They continuously change. Culture is not something that's in a box. And I think what's most important is that all of us, every single person sitting here, has multiple cultural identities. And whether those identities are related to our gender identity, social class, family structure, age, religion, language, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, we could go on and on, nationality, all of those come at an intersection for each of us to really be part of our cultural identities and to influence how we think about ourselves and how we think about the world. Now, one of the things I was going to do, but trying to think how to have it, is just to give you a minute and to think. I'm assuming all of you have at least some kind of piece of paper with you, but I'd like you just for a second to think about your own multiple cultural identities. And we're going to come back to this at the end. But as you think about yourself, and I often think about it as sort of an intersection where four roads come together, and I'm kind of in the middle there. And my question to you is, what are the things that are significant for you individually about your own cultural identities, multiple identities? Is it your age, your career, your gender identity, nationality, places you've lived, the languages you speak, religion, your socioeconomic class, whether you've lived in urban, rural, suburban areas, your physical ability, family structures, ethnicity, race. I'm going to just give you 30 seconds and just very quickly jot down, or if you don't have your, do it on your phone, but what are the identities that you consider really significant, that matter to you, and are part of your vision for how you look at yourself in the world? Okay, 30 seconds. What are the things that really matter to you individually? I'm not going to ask you to share it with anyone. It's just for you.
Light is coming up. Then the next problem is what? Then next is need to be reading. Yeah. We have to. then go into the input?
Yes, thank you. Select some.
Okay, keep track of that. I'll have you come back to it at the end here. So I'm going to ask you to visualize, because it's not up here, 3 Venn circles that are overlapping each other, because that's what I want to talk about. I want to take Eugene's idea of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors to talk about, when thinking about an optimal learning environment for all of our students, I would argue that that environment needs to include experiences that are culturally relevant and sustaining, experiences that are culturally expansive, and experiences that are culturally critical. And that optimal environment is right at the center of where those 3 come together. So what I'm going to do is just to talk about each one briefly as a way to think about what the components of that curriculum might be. So and I also want, as I'm talking, another distinction I want to make is that multicultural. I'm going to be talking about both multicultural and intercultural. Multicultural is a term that globally is used to talk about what happens within a society. What are the issues of inequity as experienced by groups that have often been marginalized, disregarded, stereotyped, or underrepresented? And there are many, many groups, for example, within the US that would connect to that marginalization, but it's really looking at within a society where intercultural is a term that's used to talk about going across global societies. Not only within, but thinking about the global societies and the ways in which those societies connect to each other, how we connect as human beings, what's our common humanity, as well as what makes each global culture unique in valuing our differences. One of the things that I've seen as a longtime Tucson resident is over the last 10 years, the tremendous globalization of Tucson and our schools in terms of the many, many different cultures that are global cultures and multicultural cultures that are part of our classrooms and our communities. One of the reports that I was just looking at said that Arizona was one of the top 10 states in the US now for refugees. And because it was a government report, they were not counting any of the Central American refugees as refugees. They were just coming from all the other parts of the world. So I think you and I would both know that those statistics would be much higher if they were included as well. So if we think about the first thing that I was talking about, is the curriculum culturally relevant and sustaining? Is it relevant to the lives of the kids that are in our classrooms, as well as help them to sustain and value those cultures? Not just be relevant, but actually does our curriculum value who they are and what they live? We're talking about a lot of cultural connections there. And one of the things that we know is that curriculum that is culturally relevant and sustaining happens much more frequently for someone who looks like me. Someone who's white, middle class, Christian, English speaking, heterosexual. There's many, many more opportunities for me to see myself in the curriculum than it is for many of the other children. One of the things, and this is related to literature that I keep track of, is the number of books in the U.S. that reflect children of color. And there are a number of different groups that I get those statistics from. In 2008, only 7% of the books published in the United States featured a child of color. And that includes both global cultures and U.S. cultures. So, for example, African and African American, only 7% of all the books published that year. We're finally getting up in those numbers, and it was up to 25% last year, which is clearly much higher. But 50% of the children in our schools are children of color. So there's still a tremendous discrepancy, and if we don't search out those materials, there are some of our children who will not see themselves. The materials are there, the experiences are there, but you have to really search to find them. We really need teaching strategies and materials that reflect the cultural orientations of all of our students. When I say, talking about culturally relevant, I'm recognizing that there are marginalized groups, that there are fewer representations, but I'm also arguing that all of our children need that representation. And one of the things that Rudine found in her research was that children who rarely find their lives reflected in a classroom and in the books that they read may dismiss literacy in school as irrelevant or as a threat to their lives. Or the other possibility is that they reject their own culture, because if they're not there, that's telling them either they need to reject the materials and the curriculum, or they need to reject themselves. That's really a major, major burden to put on a child. All children need to see their own cultures as valued, also in order to understand why culture matters to someone else. So, I mean, I have, okay. Yes. Well, that was the intersection. There. Okay. So this is the model that I want to work through with you, and right now, I was really talking about the culturally relevant. Whoa, that's a little. That's okay. So when you're a teacher, you always have to be flexible and go with whatever. So one of the things I argue, that didn't help. Oh, we had it. Get it? All right. No one is allowed to sleep. One of the things I'd argue is that all of us need to see that we have culture. So it's very easy for someone who looks like me to say, I don't have culture. But if I don't recognize that children who look like me don't recognize that they have cultural identities, then it's hard for them to understand themselves, but also it's hard for them to understand why culture matters in the lives of others. So that notion of all of us have those identities, and all of those identities need to be in some way reflected in school is really critical. I cannot do it.
Can you go back to the Venn diagram, please?
It'll come up again. I'm just, right now, I'm afraid to even touch it. Okay. And I want to go back here. It's coming up again. I'll show you again. When children cannot find, this is a quote from Rudine, when children cannot find themselves reflected in the books, and I would say in their classrooms, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a valuable lesson about how they're devalued in the society in which they live. And again, all children from all cultures need to find those mirrors in our classrooms. And it's not a unit, it's not a specific book, it's a constant integration of connections to children's cultures. So the first part of that Venn diagram.
Microphone.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to do too many things at one time, sorry. Is the notion of being culturally relevant and culturally sustaining. The second one is culturally expansive. What I want to argue here is that we need to engage children in cultures and points of views that go beyond their own, that expands their life spaces, expands their experiences. And we do that through immersing them into literature as well as to other kinds of experiences where they really get to see or dance or in some way consider what it means to be within another culture. And I think one of the things that's really important is that children need to be able to consider what connects us to each other, what our common humanity is, but also appreciate what makes each culture different and unique. Richard Ruiz, my colleague, always argued that difference needs to be seen as a resource, not a problem. It's differences that make our world, our communities rich and strong, because it provides such a diversity to pull from, rather than a problem that we need to solve. we also need to really think about how we challenge our kids to move beyond considering their own culture as the norm against which all other cultures are judged. And we all do that, and kids do that all the time. I would just give a really simple example. I was talking with a 5th grader, Natalia, and she picked up a picture book that I had that was from Japan. And she said to me, this book opens backwards, right? And I said to her, it depends on who's opening the book and whose perspective. Because if a child from Japan picked up one of your books, she would say it opens backwards. And it was the first time that Natalia had even thought about that her view of the world might not be the standard against which other things are viewed. It's a very simple example, but I've just watched over and over as children just assume that their norm is the norm, their way of thinking is the norm in the world. I think there are a couple of ways that we might work with children in culturally expansive. Some of the things that I've been engaged with kids is one is in-depth inquiries where they've really looked at a specific cultural community in depth in order to understand that each community has complexity and has diversity, that it's not just one thing. But the other is integrating multiple perspectives into any unit. So whether it's a unit on families or a unit on revolution or a unit on refugees, on forced journeys, how do we bring in multiple perspectives? Even, I would argue, a unit on fractions. Thinking about that in the terms of both what are the problems that kids are solving using fractions, and do those fractions reflect a variety of peoples and situations, as well as thinking about different ways in the world that people understand fractions. And not assuming that our Western perspective is the only way. Rudine says, and I'm going to each time come back to Rudine, since she was used as the frame for this conference, is that children from all social groups need books as windows onto reality. They need books that will help them understand the multicultural and the global nature of the world they live in, and their place as members of just one group in that larger world, not the only way to think about the world and their connections to other human beings. She also argues, and this is a reminder again for someone who looks like me, is that if children only see reflections of themselves in the materials that are in classrooms, that they develop an exaggerated sense of their own importance and their own value in that world. There's a very famous TED Talk on the dangers of a single story. And I think that's, when I think about a culturally expansive curriculum, there's also some concerns about that. One of the things I'm aware of is that you can do an in-depth study of a particular global culture and establish all kinds of stereotypes, not really expand children's life spaces. So I was working with a group of 5th graders, and we were doing literature circles around China, and the novels that we could find at 5th grade level were all novels that were historical, most of them about the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And I didn't really think about it at first, but about halfway through the kids' discussions of these books, we realized that they had developed all kinds of stereotypes about China. Because of course they assumed that even though we knew these books were historical, the kids assumed they were contemporary, and this is what China was like right now. And this was the only way it looked like. So even though we've been trying to expand their perspectives and have them look at China, we had, in essence, established a whole set of stereotypes that we had to work really hard then to bring in other materials and to diversify what they were thinking. What Aditi points out is that when we see a people or event as one thing, and we see that over and over and over again, that it trains us to think about all peoples that way. It becomes part of how we see the world. It becomes a commonplace narrative. And it reduces people to that single narrative. We do need windows into many rooms, but we need to know which of those windows are easy to see into, which of those are boarded up, and which we can't even find. To give you another example, and again, my examples are literature because that's what I know the best, but we were looking for novels for 4th and 5th graders about Mexico, and just, fiction that displayed regular everyday life in Mexico. What we found were novels about crossing the border. That's an example. Those windows are really easy to find. The windows of Mexican people as migrants. But that is not in any way, shape, or form the whole of life in Mexico. We also found Some windows that were about rural life, about life in small villages. We didn't find was life in large cities, which again is, I mean, Mexico has incredible cities where many, many people live. So we have to be aware of, in the materials we're using, what are the windows that are completely boarded up and therefore going to give kids misconceptions and develop a commonplace narrative that's inaccurate. There's a whole theory right now that's called Cosmopolitanism. And it's based on the notion of the cosmos as the world in a broad way, trying to get beyond just national identity. And I think that the Cosmopolitanism helps us to understand what it would mean to be a sliding door. So remember the sliding door, the glass door that Nadine talked about, is where you actually enter the world. You're not just viewing it through a window, you actually enter into it. And that's one of the reasons I love literature, is that I think literature often does take children right into that story world. They experience it rather than just learning some facts. And the whole idea behind cosmopolitanism is that we need to be able to imaginatively enter another's world. And I like this one. We have to be willing to be open and learn from another's life and experiences, not just tolerate them. That tolerate them is too low. It's really about, are we open to learning from? And that we have a sense of obligation and responsibility to others to become more conscious and committed instead of just trying to personally connect to a person's life experiences. I often find, as I'm using global literature, that students will say to me, but I can't personally connect to this. And my response to them is, you don't need to personally connect. You don't have to, your experiences are different than the experiences of this character. But you, as a citizen of this world, you have a sense of obligation, and you need to be conscious and committed to others, to learning about them and with them, not just dismissing them. What the term that's used within cosmopolitanism is that we have to develop a hospitable imagination. And what they mean by that is that you have to engage the other, a person outside of yourself whose life experiences are different than yours. You have to be willing to engage them through a perspective of openness that is without limit. And that's the part that I find really challenging is, I am open to others' perspectives, but the notion that I don't judge at all, that I open without limit to try to understand someone who life's experiences who seems so very, very different from my own, that really pushes me. They're not saying that you need to take those on as your own values, but that you have to be that open to first understanding. And that what you're always doing is you're balancing reflective loyalty to the known. In other words, valuing reflection on your own life experiences and values, along with a reflective openness to the new. The other distinction that's made that I think is really important is the distinction between, and that relates to this notion of connection, between empathy and sympathy. That empathy is the ability to understand someone through connecting at the level of emotions. To say, this is something within myself, my experience isn't the same as yours, but I've experienced loneliness, I've experienced fear, I've experienced joy. And connecting at that level, instead of trying to connect at that level of experience, because our experiences across both multicultural and global cultures is often very, very different. Whereas sympathy is feeling bad for somebody and wanting to make it better for them, which is a very, I'm going to save you kind of perspective, and often leads to disconnection. I find that very often when I'm working with students and reading global literature, their reply is, oh, I am so glad that I live here in Tucson because it's so bad in the other parts of the world. And they really enter into what I would call a pity party, feeling pity for someone else, instead of connecting deeply in terms of empathy. The third circle is culturally critical. And that's the recognition that we need to go beyond celebrating diversity and cross-cultural harmony to thinking about how can we really transform society and work for social justice and equity. And here I'm going to really pull from Paulo Freire, who argues that when you raise issues of inequity and power, discrimination, you need to do three things. And I think we often stop at the first one. The first is to critique. We have to question the way the world is, and ask why those problems exist and who benefits from that. And why, for a study I was doing with 4th and 5th graders around hunger, why are people hungry? And really looking at what those factors of inequity are. For example, the kids thought initially that there was simply not enough food in the world, and that's the reason people were hungry. And as they learned more and more, they realized there was enough food. It was how it was distributed, and lots of other reasons behind that were leading to inequities in who had food and who didn't. But if you stop at critique, at pointing out everything that's wrong, what happens is you feel guilt, you feel overwhelmed, and you're like frozen. You can't move forward. So Freire said, you start with critique, because you don't want to just accept that this is the way the world's always going to be. So you question that. But then the second thing you need to do is to hope. You have to say, imagine what could be, what could be. What are alternatives, and how can we develop a vision of possibility, of equity? And you ask, what if? What if things were this way instead? And then based on that, we act for social change. We ask, by asking, so what? And what do we do? We actually started that unit on hunger because the kids had been immediately moved to action. The good canned food drives we do in many of our schools. They were asked to bring in cans of food without understanding and critiquing why that problem exists, or thinking about what could we do? What are possibilities for a world that doesn't have hunger? And therefore, the action was highly superficial, and kids had to be bribed in order to bring the food in, right? I mean, it really worked against, and I think often we move right to action, and without both either critiquing and thinking about possibilities, we end up with kids who think on the surface and act on the surface instead of actually getting to what the real problems are. And through, I think, this kind of process, children begin to develop a critical consciousness about their everyday world and the way power plays out in their relationships and in society. We were doing a unit on an inquiry on human rights with a group of 4th graders, and our idea of that unit was that unit was going to look broadly at different kinds of human rights around the world, like the right for an education, the right for environmental sustainability, and so forth. And the kids pointed out that one of the basic human rights issues for them was that in school, they were often treated as without rights. And they first wanted to look at human rights as they connected to how adults interacted with them in the school context. For example, the fact that all these new playground rules kept emerging, and they didn't know where they came from, and often interrupted really important play for them. And they felt that was a human rights violation. Isn't that interesting to think about that? And their question was, why do we never have a voice? And how can we be part of the process? We're kids, we don't get to make the decisions, but why are our voices never there? So really thinking, I think that's kids with a critical consciousness who are seeing where those inequities are in their everyday world. Now, I started out talking about intersectionality. I know you've got a session where somebody's going to talk more about this particular theory. But intersectionality is a theory that really looks at the fact that it really grew out of African American scholars, particularly women scholars, who said, the fact that I'm black is only one part of why I experienced oppression and inequity. The other is that I'm female. And unless you look at, and that I may be gay or lesbian, that I live in poverty, that there are all of these multiple ways in which the intersections of my identities determine how much privilege and how much oppression is in my life. And you can only understand me through that intersectionality. So for example, it's too dark for have you do that, but I was going to have you go back to your own intersection and think about how do those position you, either in terms of inequity or in terms of privilege. So that I know for myself, for example, I grew up in poverty. I was part of a religion that was definitely not mainstream. But now as an adult, clearly, my identities are in positions of privilege. I'm highly educated. I'm a professor. I'm comfortable in terms of finances. I'm white. I'm Christian. So for me, it's really being aware that my intersectionality does position me as a person of privilege, and thinking about what does that mean to walk alongside those for whom their intersectionality has traditionally led to inequities, and how can I be a cultural ally, as I said, walking alongside, both aware of my positionality and being able to use it along with others. So going back to circles, and what I was arguing is that an optimal learning environment is one that's in the very center. That what we're trying to do is to think about how we can create experiences that are culturally expansive, culturally relevant, sustaining, culturally critical. And as you go to the breakout sessions, you'll get practical examples that probably will fit one of those, one or more of those, to really think about what this might actually look like in our classrooms. And I would argue again that why we should care about that is that the kids we are working with are in the process of becoming. And who they become is really based on the kinds of opportunities, is influenced by the kind of opportunities we offer them in our classrooms. And if we want to be part of not just sort of recreating the world as it already is with all of its problems, then we have to create a world in our classrooms that offers a new sense of possibility and that does influence kids in their process of becoming in ways that are positive. We can do, what we're trying to do is to really teach kids in ways that will invite them to become, develop these new envisionments of what the world might be, instead of simply teaching them to continue the world as it is now. Thank you.